Hey everyone, and welcome back. Tonight, we're going to explore something that might sound simple at first, but was actually one of the most physically demanding, time-consuming, and socially complex tasks of Victorian life. Doing the laundry. Before you settle in, if you enjoy these slow journeys through history, go ahead and like this video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely want to. And let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. It's always interesting to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, get comfortable. Maybe adjust your pillow, pull up your blanket, and let's step back in time together. Dim the lights if you'd like. Let the outside world fade away. Tonight, we're walking into the life of a Victorian laundress. And I promise you, by the end of this, you'll never look at your washing machine the same way again. When we think of Victorian England, we might picture grand balls, elegant dresses, and pristine white collars on gentlemen's shirts. We see the finished product, the clean pressed, perfectly presented clothing. But someone had to keep all those clothes clean, and that someone was usually a woman, often working from before dawn until well after dark. Her hands raw and red, her back aching, standing over steaming tubs of water in conditions that would make a modern workplace safety inspector faint. This wasn't a quick task. Laundry day wasn't really a day at all. It was a multi-day ordeal that could consume a full week of labor for a household. And if you were a professional laundress, washing clothes for multiple families, well, you basically never stopped. The work was continuous, cyclical, and endless. So let's begin at the very beginning, with the preparation that had to happen before a single garment even touched water. Let's step into that world slowly, carefully, paying attention to every detail, because it's in the details that we really understand what life was like. The first thing you need to understand about Victorian laundry is that it required planning. Serious, methodical planning. You couldn't just toss clothes in a machine and press a button. You had to think days ahead, sometimes a full week ahead, about what needed to be washed, how it needed to be washed, and in what order everything would be processed. Monday was traditionally laundry day in Victorian England. This wasn't just a random choice or a bit of folklore. There was actual logic behind it. Sunday was the day of rest, the Lord's Day, when no work was to be done beyond the absolute necessities of food preparation and basic care. So Monday made sense as the day to tackle the biggest, most exhausting chore of the week. You'd had your day of rest, attended church, perhaps had a slightly better meal than usual. Monday was when you rolled up your sleeves, metaphorically and literally, and faced the mountain of dirty laundry that had accumulated over the previous week or two. But the preparation actually began on Sunday evening, after church, after the Sunday dinner had been eaten and cleared away, when the light was fading and the household was winding down into the quiet of evening. This was when the laundress would begin her work in earnest, even though the actual washing wouldn't start until the next morning. A laundress, whether she was a servant in a large household or a woman doing her own family's wash, would start by gathering the dirty laundry from wherever it had been accumulating. In a well-organized household, there might be designated laundry baskets in various rooms. In the bedrooms for sheets and personal garments. In the kitchen for towels and cloths. In the dining room for table linens. She'd make her rounds, collecting everything, carrying it to wherever the sorting would take place, usually the scullery or a dedicated washhouse if the family was fortunate enough to have one. The pile of dirty laundry was always larger than you expected, Always, even if you thought you had a handle on how much washing needed doing, the actual mountain of clothes and linens was somehow more substantial when gathered together in one place. This was the reality of Victorian life. People didn't have vast wardrobes like we do today. A working-class family might have only a few changes of clothes per person. But that meant those clothes got worn hard, got dirty quickly, and needed washing regularly. Then came the sorting. And this wasn't simple sorting like we might do today, casually separating lights from darks. This was an art form that required knowledge, experience, and a keen eye for fabric, color, and the nature of stains. First, she'd separate the whites from the coloreds. This is something we still do today, so it sounds familiar. But in Victorian times, this was even more critical, because the washing methods were harsh. Very harsh. The soap was caustic. The water was boiling hot. The agitation was violent. Colored fabrics could bleed. And they did, frequently and dramatically. A red petticoat thrown in with white linens could turn everything pink. And there was no going back. No color-safe bleach. No special detergent designed to prevent color transfer. If you ruined something, it stayed ruined, and you'd have to answer for it. But it wasn't just whites and colors. Oh no. There were subcategories within subcategories. Fine linens, the good tablecloths used for special occasions, were separated from everyday linens. The master's shirts were kept separate from the children's clothes. Delicate undergarments, with their ribbons and lace trim, were kept away from sturdy work shirts and heavy aprons. Each fabric had its own personality, its own needs, its own likelihood of falling apart if you looked at it wrong. Cotton could handle rough treatment. Linen was tough, but could yellow if not washed properly. Wool would shrink and felt if you weren't careful. Silk was temperamental and required gentle handling. Each required different water temperatures, different washing techniques, different drying methods. The laundress had to keep all of this in her head, making split-second decisions about which pile each garment belonged in. Then there were the stains. A good laundress could look at a stain and know exactly what it was and how to treat it, almost instinctively. This was knowledge passed down from mother to daughter, from senior laundress to junior, accumulated through years of experience and occasional disasters. Blood? That required immediate cold water treatment. Never hot, or you'd set the stain permanently into the fabric. The proteins in blood would cook in hot water, bonding to the fibers, making removal impossible. So blood-stained items went into a special pile, one that would be soaked in cold water first, then grease. Whether it was from food, lamp oil, or machinery, grease required pre-treatment. You'd need to rub it with chalk or fuller's earth, substances that would absorb the oil before washing. These items were marked mentally, sometimes literally with a pin or a bit of thread, so they wouldn't be forgotten in the rush of the next day's work. Ink? Well, ink was the nightmare of every laundress. Ink stains were notoriously difficult. You might try lemon juice or salt or a paste made of sour milk. Sometimes nothing worked, and the garment was simply ruined. But you tried anyway because the alternative was facing the wrath of whoever owned the garment. Mud was common, especially in the wet months, and it required patience. The temptation was to immediately scrub at mud, but that often made it worse, grinding the dirt deeper into the fabric. The proper method was to let the mud dry completely, then brush it off with a stiff brush before washing. So muddy items went into yet another pile. Wine stains, tea stains, coffee stains, each had its own requirements. The laundress would examine each item carefully, turning it over in her hands, looking for anything that required special attention. This examination took time. You couldn't rush it, miss a stain during sorting, and you might set it during washing, making it permanent. On Sunday evening, after sorting, the laundress would fill large tubs with cold water and place the dirtiest items into them to soak overnight. This was called the buck in some regions, though that term could also refer to the lye solution used for the heaviest cleaning. The soaking helped loosen dirt and stains, giving the wash water a fighting chance the next day. These soaking tubs weren't small, dainty basins. They were massive wooden or zinc tubs, sometimes as large as a bathtub. And they were heavy, even when empty. A large wooden tub could weigh 30 or 40 pounds on its own. Filled with water and soaking linens, they became immovable objects that dominated whatever space they occupied. The water for soaking came from wherever the household got its water, and this varied enormously depending on wealth and location. If you were wealthy, you might have a pump in your kitchen or scullery, a luxury that saved hours of labor. If you were working class, particularly in urban areas, you might be hauling water from a communal pump down the street, bucket by heavy bucket. Each bucket, filled to the brim, weighed about 20 pounds. Your arms would burn from carrying it. Your hands would ache from gripping the handle. And a large soaking tub could require 10, 12, even 15 buckets of water. That meant making 10 to 15 trips to the pump, waiting your turn if others were there, filling your bucket, carrying it back, pouring it into the tub, and going back for more. In some areas, water had to be purchased from water carriers who would bring it to your door. This made every drop precious. You conserved water, used it for multiple purposes, and wasted nothing. The water used for soaking laundry might later be used for scrubbing floors or watering a small garden. While the tubs filled and the laundry soaked, the laundress had other preparations to make. She needed to gather her supplies, and this required forethought and organization. Soap, if the household could afford it. In Victorian times, commercial soap was available but expensive. Many households made their own soap, a smelly, time-consuming process that involved boiling animal fat with lye. The soap that resulted was harsh and effective for cleaning clothes, but terrible for human skin. Store-bought soap was a luxury, often used sparingly and only for the finest items. Then there was washing soda, also called soda crystals or sal soda. This was sodium carbonate, and it was essential for laundry. It softened hard water, making the soap more effective. It boosted the cleaning power of the wash water, but it was also caustic, and too much could damage fabrics, particularly delicate ones. The laundress needed to know exactly how much to use, a knowledge that came from experience. Lye was kept for the dirtiest, most heavily soiled items. This was a strong alkaline solution made from wood ash, and it was incredibly harsh. It could burn skin if you weren't careful. But it was effective at removing stubborn stains and ground-in dirt that nothing else could touch. Blue or laundry blue was essential for whites. This was a blue powder or liquid that, when added to the rinse water, deposited a tiny amount of blue pigment on white fabrics. This counteracted the natural yellowing that occurred over time, making whites appear brighter and whiter. Too much blue, and your whites would actually look blue, which was a disaster. Too little, and the whites would look dingy. The amount had to be just right. Starch was needed for items that required crispness. Shirt collars, cuffs, aprons, doilies, table linens, all of these benefited from starch. The starch came as a powder that had to be mixed with water to the right consistency. Too thick, and it would flake off the fabric. Too thin, and it wouldn't provide enough stiffness. If the household made its own soap, and many did, to save money, the laundress might spend part of Sunday afternoon checking the soap supply, making sure there was enough for the week ahead. Homemade soap was a production in itself, a task usually done a few times a year in large batches. You needed animal fat, collected and saved from cooking. You needed lye, made by running water through wood ash and collecting the liquid that resulted. You needed a large pot, a fire, and several hours of stirring and waiting. The smell during soap making was distinctive and not pleasant. Boiling animal fat has a heavy, greasy smell that clings to everything. Mixed with the sharp, acrid smell of lye, it created an odor that was simply tolerated because the end result was necessary. The soap, when finished, was poured into molds and left to harden, then cut into bars and stored for use. As Sunday evening turned into night, the laundress might look at the tubs of soaking laundry, at the piles of sorted clothes, at her gathered supplies, and mentally prepare herself for the marathon ahead. Because Monday was going to be long, full on, and physically brutal in ways that are hard to fully explain to someone who's never done manual laundry. But that was tomorrow's problem. Tonight, there was still Sunday dinner to clear up, dishes to wash, perhaps some mending to do by candlelight if her eyes could handle it. And then whatever brief rest she could manage before the next day began, as it would, long before dawn broke over the rooftops. Sleep didn't come easily on Sunday night if you were a laundress. Your mind would be running through the tasks ahead. Did you remember to mark that grease stain? Was there enough soap? Would the weather be clear for drying? The mental burden of the work was almost as heavy as the physical burden would be. Monday morning arrived early, very early. For a professional laundress or a household servant responsible for the washing, the day often began at 4 or 5 in the morning, sometimes even earlier in the winter months. This meant rising in complete darkness, before the sun had even thought about appearing, before the roosters crowed, before the rest of the world stirred. There was a reason for this early start. Laundry required hot water, vast quantities of it, and heating water took time. Hours, in fact. You couldn't just turn on a tap and get hot water. Every drop had to be heated laboriously, and the process couldn't be rushed. The first task, even before getting dressed properly or having anything to eat, was to get the copper going. The copper was the centerpiece of Victorian laundry work, and understanding what it was helps you understand the whole process. A copper was a large, built-in boiler, typically made of copper or cast iron, that was set into brickwork with a firebox underneath. In a well-equipped household, the copper might be located in a separate washhouse, a dedicated building or room just for laundry. In more modest homes, it might be in the scullery or even in the kitchen itself. The copper could hold anywhere from 20 to 50 gallons of water, depending on its size and the wealth of the household. If the household didn't have a built-in copper, and many working-class homes didn't, they'd use the largest pot they owned on the kitchen stove. This was less efficient, less convenient, and made the whole process even more challenging. But people made do with what they had. The process of starting the copper was methodical and couldn't be skipped or shortened. First, the copper had to be filled with water, and this meant yet more trips to the pump or well. In the dark, in the cold of early morning, the laundress would make trip after trip, carrying heavy buckets of water. The wooden yoke used by some to carry 2 buckets at once was helpful, but also painful. The weight of 2 full buckets balanced on your shoulders sounds efficient, but after several trips, your shoulders would ache, your neck would be sore, and the straps would dig into your flesh even through clothing. The copper needed to be filled nearly to the top, and depending on its size, this could mean 30, 40, 50 buckets of water. Let's pause and really think about that for a moment. 50 buckets of water. Each bucket weighs about 20 pounds when full. That's 1,000 pounds of water, carried 20 pounds at a time, 1 bucket at a time. Sometimes 2 if you were using a yoke. In the summer months, this was merely exhausting. In winter, it was additionally miserable. Your hands would be numb from the cold water splashing on them. The water in the bucket might have a skin of ice on it. Your feet would be cold in your worn boots as you walked back and forth in the pre-dawn darkness. Your breath would steam in the frigid air. Once the copper was finally full, the fire needed to be built. This was a skill in itself, not something you could just do carelessly and expect good results. You had to carefully build a fire with kindling and coal or wood, coaxing it to life, feeding it gradually, knowing how to make it burn hot enough to heat all that water, but not so hot that it became dangerous or consumed too much fuel. The kindling went in first, small, dry pieces of wood that would catch easily from a flame. This might be specially kept dry wood, or it might be whatever you could scavenge. In poorer households, children might be sent to collect fallen twigs and branches, anything that would burn. On top of the kindling went slightly larger pieces of wood, arranged carefully to allow airflow. Fire needs air to burn, and if you packed the firebox too tightly, the fire would smolder and smoke rather than burn cleanly. But if you left it too loose, the fire might not sustain itself. Once the kindling caught and the smaller wood was burning well, larger pieces of coal or wood would be added. Coal was more efficient and burned hotter, but it was also more expensive. Wood was cheaper, but required more tending and produced less consistent heat. The choice depended on what the household could afford. The fire had to be maintained throughout the morning, throughout the entire washing process, really. It couldn't be allowed to die down, or you'd lose your heat and have to start over. But it couldn't be built up too high, or the water would boil too vigorously, potentially damaging delicate fabrics and creating so much steam that the workspace became unbearable. Tending the fire was a constant background task. Every so often, the laundress would need to check it, add more fuel if needed, adjust the coals or wood to maintain the right temperature. If you were lucky enough to have someone to help, they might be assigned to fire duty. But often the laundress was managing everything herself, juggling multiple tasks simultaneously. While the water heated, which could take an hour, sometimes 2 hours depending on the size of the copper and the strength of the fire, the laundress would retrieve the items that had been soaking overnight. These were now thoroughly waterlogged, heavy, cold, and dripping. Have you ever tried to lift a soaking wet bed sheet? It's extraordinarily heavy, much heavier than you'd expect. The water has saturated every fiber, and the weight of all that water concentrated in the fabric is substantial. A dry sheet might weigh a couple of pounds. Wet, it might weigh 15 or 20 pounds. Now multiply that by multiple sheets, plus other linens, all soaking in a large tub. She'd reach into the cold water, her hands immediately registering the shock of the temperature, and pull out item after item. Each one would be wrung out as much as she could manage by hand, twisting the fabric tightly, squeezing out the dirty water. This was the first of what would be many, many times during the day that her hands would ache from wringing. The wringing technique mattered. You had to twist the fabric tightly enough to remove water, but not so forcefully that you damaged it. Some fabrics could handle aggressive wringing. Others, particularly older or more delicate items, could tear if twisted too hard. The laundress had to make these judgments constantly, automatically, without thinking. The dirty soaking water that was squeezed out would be saved in some households. Nothing was wasted in Victorian times if it could be reused. This dirty water might be used for cleaning floors, for washing outdoor areas, for watering the garden. Water was too precious to simply throw away without getting every possible use from it. As each soaked item was wrung out, it would be inspected again in the growing light. Stains that had been marked the night before would be checked. Had the soaking helped? Sometimes yes, sometimes no. If not, the stain would need more aggressive treatment. For blood stains, she might scrape at them with her thumbnail or a dull knife, working in cold water, trying to break up the proteins. This could take several minutes per stain, working patiently, checking her progress, working some more. For grease stains, she'd rub in more chalk or fuller's earth, working it into the fabric with her fingers. Fuller's earth was a type of clay that had excellent absorption properties. It would pull the grease out of the fabric, or at least that was the hope. The treated area would have a light-colored, dusty appearance until it was washed. For particularly stubborn stains, she might try a paste made of soap and washing soda, rubbing it directly into the fabric with her fingers or a small brush, and then letting it sit while she worked on other items. This paste was harsh on the hands, making them dry and uncomfortable. But it was effective on stains. By now, the sky would be getting lighter. The absolute darkness of early morning would be giving way to that grey pre-dawn twilight. The household would be starting to wake. Someone might appear in the kitchen for early tea or porridge, stepping carefully around the piles of wet laundry, the buckets, the zinc tubs that were being positioned for the day's work. The laundress might snatch a quick cup of tea if she was fortunate, perhaps with a piece of bread, standing up while she drank it because there was no time to sit. Or she might have nothing at all, working on an empty stomach because the work couldn't wait. Finally, after what felt like forever, but was probably about 90 minutes, the copper would be ready. The water would be steaming hot, approaching boiling point. You could see the steam rising from the surface, could feel the heat radiating from the copper even from a few feet away. This was the moment when the actual washing could finally begin. But first, the water needed to be prepared. It wasn't enough to just have hot water. The water needed to be treated to make it effective for washing. The laundress would add soap to the copper. If using bar soap, she'd take a knife and shave the soap into thin curls or small pieces that would dissolve more easily in the hot water. This took time and care. The soap was hard, and shaving it required pressure on the knife. It was easy to slip and cut yourself if you weren't careful. If using soap powder or flakes, which were available but more expensive, she'd measure it out carefully. Soap was a significant expense, and using too much would be noticed. She'd be scolded or have her wages docked if she was too generous with the household soap supply. But using too little meant the clothes wouldn't get properly clean, which would also result in scolding. Finding the right balance required experience. Then came the washing soda. This was measured out and added to the hot water, dissolving quickly in the heat. The amount depended on the hardness of the water, something the laundress would know from experience. Hard water required more soda. Soft water required less. Too much soda could damage fabrics, making them weak and prone to tearing. Too little, and the soap wouldn't work effectively. The water would foam and bubble slightly as the soap and soda dissolved and mixed. The smell, a particular smell of soap and heat and wet fabric that's hard to describe if you've never experienced it, would fill the air. It wasn't entirely unpleasant, but it was distinctive and pervasive. Not all the whites went into the copper at once. This is important to understand. You couldn't just throw everything in together and hope for the best. Each item needed space to move in the water, needed the hot soapy water to circulate around it and through it, needed to be stirred and agitated properly. Overcrowding the copper meant nothing would get properly clean. The laundress would select the first batch carefully. Usually, the most heavily soiled items went first. Kitchen towels that had been used for days, cleaning rags, cloths that had been used for dirty work. These needed the hottest, freshest water and the longest boiling time. They could handle the rough treatment, and they needed it. Each item would be pushed down into the hot water using a long wooden stick. This stick had different names in different regions. It might be called a dolly, a posser, a washing dolly, or a copper stick. It was essentially a long wooden pole, maybe 4 or 5 feet in length, with a handle at one end, and sometimes a crosspiece or paddle at the other end to help with stirring. The laundress would stand at the copper, the heat intense on her face and hands, and use this stick to push the items down into the water and stir them. The steam would rise up, condensing on her face, making her hair damp, fogging any windows in the room. In summer, this heat was almost unbearable. The combination of the copper's fire and the summer weather meant you were working in what felt like an oven. Sweat would pour down your face, your back, soaking your clothes almost as thoroughly as you were washing the laundry. In winter, the heat was at least somewhat welcome at first, taking the chill off your cold, tired body. But after a while, even in winter, the heat became oppressive, especially combined with the steam and the physical exertion. The stirring wasn't a gentle, occasional activity. It was constant and vigorous. The laundress would plunge the dolly stick down into the copper, lift it up, plunge it down again, over and over, creating circulation in the water. This agitation helped work the soapy water through the fabric, helped loosen dirt and stains, helped ensure everything got properly clean. Some dolly sticks had a special end piece, a wooden cross or a copper head with holes in it, specifically designed to create more agitation when plunged into the water. These worked on a similar principle to a manual washing machine, using the movement of water to clean the clothes. The stirring was hard work. Your arms would burn from the constant motion. Your shoulders would ache. Your hands would develop blisters where you gripped the wooden handle, even if you'd been doing this work for years. Standing in one position, bent slightly forward over the copper, maintaining this repetitive motion was exhausting. And remember, you couldn't stop. If you stopped stirring, the items might bunch up at the bottom of the copper, preventing proper cleaning. They might scorch if they settled against the hot copper bottom in one spot for too long. The movement had to be constant. The items would boil in the copper for anywhere from 15 minutes to a full hour, depending on how dirty they were. The dirtiest items, like kitchen cloths that had been used to clean up spills and grease, like tablecloths that had seen multiple meals, might boil for the full hour. Moderately soiled items might need 30 minutes. The laundress would make these decisions based on her assessment of each item's condition. While items boiled, she had to monitor them constantly. She'd occasionally lift an item partway out of the water with the dolly stick to check its progress. Was the water penetrating properly? Were the stains loosening? Did the item need more time? These judgments came from experience, from knowing what clean laundry looked and felt like. The water in the copper would gradually turn dirty as the soil from the clothes dissolved into it. At first, the water might just look slightly grey or cloudy. As more items were boiled, especially heavily soiled ones, the water would become darker, murkier. Eventually, it would need to be changed, or the clothes wouldn't get properly clean. They'd just be washed in dirty water, which defeated the purpose. Changing the copper water was a major undertaking. The copper had to be emptied, which was done by ladling the hot water out bucket by bucket. This was dangerous work. You were leaning over a copper full of near-boiling water, dipping a ladle or small bucket into it, lifting out the hot water, and pouring it into a larger bucket or directly into a drain if one was available. The steam would rise directly into your face. Splashes of hot water could burn your hands or arms if you weren't careful. If you lost your balance or your grip, you could seriously injure yourself. Scalding injuries were not uncommon among laundresses. I've read accounts of women suffering severe burns from accidents with the copper, burns that could leave permanent scars or, in the worst cases, led to infection and serious illness. Once the copper was emptied, it had to be refilled, which meant yet more trips to the pump with heavy buckets. Then the fire had to be built up again to reheat the fresh water. And while you waited for the water to heat, you couldn't simply rest. There was always more work to do. While the first batch boiled, the laundress would be preparing the next batch, checking items for stains, doing spot treatments, organizing piles, getting everything ready so there was no wasted time. This was constant motion, constant activity, constant decision-making. Some households had a helper for laundry day, perhaps a young girl learning the trade or a junior servant. If so, she might be assigned tasks like keeping the fire going, fetching water, preparing items for washing. But in many households, the laundress worked alone, managing every aspect of the process herself. The rhythm of laundry day was stir, check, add fuel to the fire, stir some more, check the water temperature, prepare the next batch, stir, lift items out of the copper, replace them with new items, stir, over and over for hours, until every white item had been through the copper. The house or wash house would be filled with steam by mid-morning. Everything would be damp. The walls would be running with condensation. Any windows would be completely fogged. The smell of soap and wet wool and steam would be everywhere, soaking into every surface, every breath. And this was still just the washing phase. The items coming out of the copper were clean, yes, but they still had to be rinsed multiple times to remove all the soap. They had to be wrung out repeatedly. They had to be prepared for drying. The work was nowhere near finished. After items had boiled in the copper for their designated time, they needed to come out. This was done carefully, using the dolly stick to fish them out of the boiling water. The laundress would hook the stick through a corner or fold of the fabric and lift, allowing the item to drain somewhat before transferring it to a waiting tub. The items were still very hot, steaming, and extremely heavy with water. They had to be handled carefully to avoid burns. Even using the stick, steam would rise from the fabric, and splashes of hot water could fall on hands or arms. The items were transferred to a large wooden tub or zinc bath that had been positioned near the copper. This tub was the next station in the process, where the real physical work of scrubbing would take place. Because boiling alone, while effective for killing bacteria and loosening most dirt, wasn't enough for everything. Some stains, some ground in dirt, particularly around collars and cuffs, and the areas of clothing that had direct contact with skin, required additional attention. They required scrubbing. The washboard was the tool for this job. If you've never seen a traditional washboard, picture a rectangular wooden frame with a ridged metal or wooden surface in the center. The ridges are usually corrugated, running horizontally, and they're what gives the washboard its cleaning power. The laundress would take an item from the hot water, position it on the washboard surface, and rub the fabric against the ridges, working the still soapy water through the fibers, physically scrubbing away any remaining dirt. Her hands would grip the fabric, rubbing it up and down against the ridges in a rhythmic motion. This motion, repeated thousands of times over the course of a washing day, was incredibly hard on the hands. The soap was harsh, often homemade with lye, and it would strip the natural oils from your skin, making it dry, cracked, and painful. The hot water made it worse, opening the pores and allowing the harsh soap to penetrate deeper. The constant friction of rubbing fabric against the ridges, with your knuckles sometimes scraping against the metal or wood, would leave your hands red and raw. By the end of the day, a laundress's hands would be swollen, the knuckles skinned, the fingertips wrinkled and tender. For heavily soiled areas, like shirt collars, that had absorbed days of sweat and grime, like cuffs that had been dipped in who knows what during daily work, the laundress might use a scrubbing brush. This was a stiff, bristled brush that would work additional soap into the fabric before scrubbing with real force. You had to know how much scrubbing each fabric could handle. Sturdy cotton work shirts could take vigorous scrubbing without damage. Fine linen needed a lighter touch. Delicate cotton lawn or cambric, used for ladies' undergarments and better clothing, required very gentle handling or the fabric would tear. This knowledge came from experience, from ruining items when you were learning, from being scolded or having your pay docked when you were too rough and damaged something valuable. Over time, a good laundress developed an instinct for fabric strength, knowing without thinking how much force to apply. As each item was scrubbed to satisfaction, inspected one more time to make sure no stains remained, it was placed into another tub for rinsing. And this is where the water consumption became truly staggering. Rinsing wasn't a one-time process. Items weren't rinsed once and called done. They were rinsed multiple times, 3 or 4 rinses being standard for whites, to ensure all the soap was removed. Why was this so important? Because soap left in fabric had several unpleasant effects. It would make the fabric feel sticky and uncomfortable against the skin. It would attract dirt more quickly, meaning the item would get dirty faster. And perhaps most importantly, soap residue would cause the fabric to yellow over time. The opposite of what you wanted with whites. The first rinse was in warm water. Large tubs had been set up specifically for rinsing, arranged in a sort of assembly line. The laundress would take an item, submerge it in the first rinse water, and agitate it vigorously, swishing it around, squeezing it, working the rinse water through all the fibers to flush out the soap. Then came the wringing. The item would be lifted from the rinse water and wrung out by hand. Wringing required technique and strength. You'd gather the fabric, twist it tightly in one direction, squeeze as hard as you could, then twist it the other direction, squeeze again. The water would stream out, pouring back into the tub or onto the floor. For large items like sheets, wringing was particularly challenging. One person could do it, but it was easier with 2. One person would hold one end and twist, while another person held the other end and twisted in the opposite direction, creating tension that squeezed out the water. If working alone, you'd have to tie or secure one end and then twist the other end with all your strength. The wringing put enormous strain on the hands, wrists, and forearms. Your hands would cramp. Your forearms would burn with exertion. The muscles that ran from your hands to your elbows would feel like they were on fire. After wringing from the first rinse, the item went into the second rinse. This rinse was in cooler water, often water that had been drawn fresh and hadn't been heated. The temperature difference served a purpose beyond conserving fuel. The cooler water helped close the fabric fibers after they'd been opened by the hot washing and the warm first rinse. Same process. Swish, agitate, squeeze, wring. The item became incrementally cleaner with each rinse, more of the soap dissolving away, the water becoming clearer. Then the third rinse, in cold water. By now, most of the soap should be gone. The water in this rinse would stay relatively clear, even as items were washed through it. Again, swish, agitate, wring. Finally, for whites, there was often a fourth rinse that included the blue. This was prepared in a separate tub with cold water and a small, carefully measured amount of laundry blue. The blue came in different forms. Some was a powder that had to be dissolved in water. Some came in small bags that you'd swish through the water until it reached the right color. Some came in liquid form that you'd add drop by drop. The water should turn just barely blue, the faintest tint of blue you could imagine. If the water looked obviously blue, you'd added too much, and your whites would come out blue instead of white. The goal was just enough blue pigment to counteract yellowing and make the whites appear brighter. Each white item was swished through this blue water for just a moment, long enough to deposit a microscopic amount of blue on the fibers. Then one final wring and the item was considered washed, ready for drying. Each rinse required fresh water, or at least fresher water. As the rinse water became dirty from soap and dissolved soil, it would be emptied and replaced. This happened multiple times throughout the day. If you're counting, you're realizing that between filling the copper, changing the copper water, filling rinse tubs, changing rinse water, and filling the blue water tub, the amount of water used for a full wash was enormous. A large wash for a household might use 50, 75, even 100 gallons of water or more, every drop of which had to be carried, often from a distance, in 20-pound buckets. The water carrying alone was hours of heavy labor. And remember, all of this, the boiling, the stirring, the scrubbing, the multiple rinses, all of this was happening in a carefully choreographed sequence. Items were at different stages simultaneously. While one batch was boiling in the copper, another batch was being scrubbed on the washboard. While those were being scrubbed, previously scrubbed items were going through their rinses. The laundress was constantly moving between tasks, orchestrating the entire process, making sure nothing backed up and nothing was forgotten. By mid-morning, perhaps 10 or 11 o'clock, the laundress had been working for 6 or 7 hours straight. She'd had maybe one brief break for a cup of tea or a piece of bread. Her clothes were damp with steam and sweat. Her hands were red, swollen and aching. Her back screamed from constant bending. Her arms felt like lead weights from stirring and wringing. Her feet hurt from standing on the hard floor. And she was maybe halfway through the whites. The colored items still waited. The delicates still waited. The work was relentless, and the day stretched ahead with no end in sight. Once the whites were finished, which might not be until early afternoon if the household had a lot of laundry, the laundress would turn her attention to the colored items. These required different treatment, more careful handling, and a different approach entirely. Colored items were never, ever boiled in the copper like the whites. The heat would destroy the dyes, causing them to fade dramatically or run into the fabric unevenly. A beautiful red dress could emerge from the copper, a pale, splotchy pink. A deep blue shirt could turn a sad, washed-out grey. The loss in colour couldn't be restored. The garment would be ruined. Instead, coloured items were washed in hot water, but not boiling hot. The temperature had to be carefully judged, and this was where the laundress's experience became crucial. She couldn't use a thermometer. Those weren't standard equipment for laundry. She had to test the water by touch, by instinct. The water should be as hot as you could comfortably put your hands in, but not so hot that it would scald you. That was roughly the right temperature for colored items. Too hot, and the dyes could run. Too cool, and the items wouldn't get properly clean. Finding that middle ground was a skill. The washing process for colored items was similar to the whites, but gentler throughout. Each colored item would be washed in a tub of hot, soapy water, but the agitation was by hand, not with vigorous stirring in a copper. The laundress would swish the item through the water, squeeze it gently, swish it again, working the soapy water through the fabric. If an item needed scrubbing, it was done very gently on the washboard, with much less pressure than used for whites. The goal was to remove dirt without disturbing the dyes. This took patience and a light touch. The laundress had to be constantly aware of which colors were most likely to bleed. Reds were notorious for this. Even supposedly color-fast reds could release dye, particularly if the garment was new or hadn't been washed many times. Deep blues could also be problematic. Bright yellows sometimes faded quickly with repeated washing. Dark greens might lose their vibrancy. Some laundresses washed each colored item individually. especially if they were valuable or particularly prone to color loss. This meant the process took even longer. But it was necessary to prevent disasters. Can you imagine the horror of washing a week's worth of laundry, spending an entire day at exhausting labor, only to have one red petticoat turn all the other colored garments pink? You'd be looking for a new position, or at the very least, paying for the damage from your meager wages. For this reason, items of uncertain color fastness might be tested first. The laundress might dampen a small hidden area of the garment, press it with a white cloth, and see if any color transferred. If it did, that item would be washed completely alone, in its own water, to prevent contamination of other items. The soap used for colored items was often less harsh than that used for whites. Some laundresses used soft soap, a gel-like soap that was milder and less likely to affect dyes. Some used soap made specifically for colored fabrics, though this was more expensive. The rinsing process for colored items was also different from whites. Usually, just 2 rinses were sufficient, both in cool or cold water. The goal was to remove the soap without exposing the items to unnecessary water that might leach out the dyes. The less time colored items spent in water, the better for preserving the colors. No blue was used for colored items, obviously, since that would tint them. Instead, the final rinse might include a small amount of vinegar. Some laundresses believed vinegar helped set colors and prevent fading. Whether this was actually effective is debatable, but it was common practice and probably didn't hurt. The vinegar smell would be noticeable during this phase, sharp and acidic, cutting through the ever-present smell of soap and steam. Just a splash of vinegar in a tub of cold water, and the colored items would be given a final swish through it. As the colored items were washed and rinsed, they too had to be wrung out thoroughly, but again, less forcefully than the whites. Wringing colored items too hard could damage the dyed fibers, causing the color to look uneven or streaky once dry. It was a balance between removing enough water to make drying practical and not manhandling the garments in a way that would ruin their appearance. Some colored items, particularly those made of wool or containing wool, required special cold water washing to prevent shrinkage. Wool is particularly vulnerable to shrinking, a process called felting, where the fibers lock together and the garment becomes smaller and stiffer. This happens when wool is exposed to heat and agitation. So wool items, whether colored or not, were washed in cool or lukewarm water, never hot. The washing was done with minimal agitation, gently pressing the garment in the soapy water rather than swishing or scrubbing. The rinsing had to be done in water of the same temperature as the washing water, because any sudden temperature change could cause shrinking. Wringing wool was particularly tricky. You couldn't twist it the way you'd twist cotton or linen. Instead, you'd press the water out, squeezing gently, or roll the garment in a towel and press on the towel to absorb the water. This was time-consuming but necessary to preserve the garment's shape and size. By now, it might be mid-afternoon, perhaps 2 or 3 in the clock. The laundress had been working for 9 or 10 hours, with only the briefest of breaks. Her hands were pruned from constant water exposure, the skin white and wrinkled, red and raw from the harsh soap and hot water. The skin on her fingertips might be cracking. Small, painful splits in the skin that would sting every time they touched water or soap. Every joint in her body ached. Her knees hurt from standing. Her back was a constant source of pain. Her shoulders felt like they were on fire. her hands cramped periodically, the muscles seizing from overuse. But there was still more to do. The delicate items still waited, and these required even more careful attention. The delicate item was saved for last, and not just because they required less aggressive washing. They were saved for last because by this point in the day, the laundress was tired, moving more slowly, and the extra care required for delicates needed that slower pace. Rushing through delicate items was a sure way to destroy them, and these were often the most valuable items in the household's wardrobe. A silk blouse might cost more than a laundress made in a month. A lace collar could be a family heirloom, irreplaceable. The pressure of handling such items was significant. Silk was particularly challenging. It's a protein fiber, like wool, which means it's susceptible to damage from heat, harsh chemicals, and rough handling. Silk had to be washed in cool or lukewarm water, never hot. The soap had to be very mild, gentler than what was used for other fabrics. Some laundresses made a special soap solution for silk, using just a tiny amount of soft soap dissolved in lukewarm water, until the water was barely sudsy. Too much soap would be difficult to rinse out, and could leave the silk feeling stiff or tacky. The silk garment would be submerged in this gentle solution and moved carefully through the water. No scrubbing. No aggressive swishing, just gentle movement, allowing the water to flow through the fabric, lifting away any soil. This process couldn't remove heavy stains or dirt, which is why silk garments were typically kept away from situations where they might get heavily soiled. The rinsing of silk was equally careful. Multiple rinses in cool water, each time gently pressing the garment in the water, allowing it to sit, then pressing again. The water would be changed between rinses if it looked at all cloudy. The wringing of silk was the most delicate part. Silk is much weaker when wet than when dry, and aggressive wringing could tear the fabric or distort its shape. The technique was to support the wet silk carefully, allowing excess water to drain naturally, then gently pressing and squeezing to remove more water without twisting or pulling. Some laundresses would roll the silk garment in a clean towel, a white towel, so there was no risk of color transfer, and then press on the towel-wrapped bundle, allowing the towel to absorb the water. This was safer than wringing but also more time-consuming. Lace was perhaps the most nerve-wracking of all items to wash. Lace collars, lace cuffs, lace trim on petticoats and nightgowns, these were fragile, intricate, and expensive. A moment's carelessness could result in tears or stretched threads that would ruin the piece. Fine lace was often washed separately from everything else, in its own bowl of lukewarm water with the mildest soap available. The lace would be fully submerged and allowed to soak briefly, just a few minutes to loosen any soils. Then, using just fingertips, the laundress would gently work the water through the lace, being careful not to pull or stretch the delicate threads. For very fine lace, some laundresses used a special technique. They'd place the lace in a clean glass jar or bottle with soapy water, seal it, and shake the jar gently. This allowed the lace to be cleaned without direct handling, which could stretch or tear the delicate threads. The agitation from shaking the jar would clean the lace without putting stress on any individual thread. After washing, the lace would be rinsed in clear water, again in a jar if using that method, or simply by gently swishing it in a bowl of clean water. No wringing whatsoever. The lace would be carefully lifted from the water and placed on a clean white cloth to absorb excess water. Then came the pinning. To maintain its shape while drying, lace was often pinned to a board or cloth. This was detailed, painstaking work. The lace would be stretched gently to its proper shape and pinned at regular intervals with the rust-proof pins, usually brass or silver pins, to prevent rust stains. Each point and scallop of the lace had to be pinned properly to maintain the design. This could take many minutes for each piece of lace, but it was necessary. Without pinning, lace would dry in a crumpled, distorted shape that would never look right again. Then there were specialty items that required even more unusual treatment. Items that we might not even think of as requiring washing, but that Victorians took seriously. Feathers and feather trims, which were popular on hats and accessories, needed to be cleaned carefully to avoid ruining their appearance. Sometimes they were cleaned with dry methods, using cornmeal or flour to absorb dirt. The cornmeal would be rubbed into the feathers, worked through them gently, then brushed out. The cornmeal would absorb the oils and dirt, leaving the feathers cleaner. If feathers needed wet cleaning, it was done very carefully in lukewarm water with mild soap, and they were dried quickly to prevent them from becoming matted or losing their fluffy appearance. Sometimes they were steamed to refresh them and restore their shape. Leather gloves were another specialty item. They couldn't be submerged in water or they'd be ruined. Instead, they were cleaned while being worn on the hands. The laundress, or the person who owned the gloves, would put them on and then use a cloth dampened with very mild, soapy water to wipe the gloves clean. This way, the gloves maintained their shape. After wiping with soapy water, another cloth dampened with plain water would be used to rinse away the soap. Then the gloves would be dried carefully, sometimes stuffed with paper to help them maintain their shape, and treated with a light coating of oil or glycerin to keep the leather supple. Furs and fur trims were not washed at all with water, as that would ruin them completely. Instead, they were brushed carefully to remove dust and dirt. Sometimes sawdust or bran would be rubbed into the fur to absorb oils and grime, then brushed out thoroughly. This was delicate work, requiring patience and a light touch. By the time all the delicate items were finished, carefully washed, rinsed, and prepared for drying, the day would be well into late afternoon or early evening. The laundress had been working for 12, 13, 14 hours, with only brief moments of rest. Her exhaustion was profound, but the work still wasn't finished. Everything now had to be dried, and depending on the weather, the time of year, and the facilities available, drying could be simple or it could be yet another challenge. If the weather was fine, clear, and breezy, but not windy, the laundress would take the washed items outside to hang on the clothesline. This sounds simple enough, but like everything else in Victorian laundry, there was a proper way to do it, a method that ensured items dried properly and weren't damaged in the process. First, before hanging anything, the clothesline itself had to be inspected and cleaned. A dirty clothesline could leave marks on clean laundry, undoing hours of work. The laundress would take a damp cloth and wipe down the entire length of the line, removing any dust, bird droppings, or other contamination that might have accumulated since the last use. In some households, the clothesline was taken down and stored between uses to keep it clean, which meant it had to be put up on laundry day. This required 2 people typically, one at each end, stringing the line between 2 posts or between hooks on buildings. The line had to be pulled tight tight enough that it wouldn't sag under the weight of wet laundry, but not so tight that it might snap. Some households had multiple clotheslines at different heights, allowing for more efficient use of space. The higher lines were for larger items like sheets and tablecloths that could hang freely without touching the ground. Lower lines were for smaller items like undergarments and stockings. Each item was hung with specific technique and intention. Sheets were typically hung folded in half over the line, with the fold at the top. This distributed the weight more evenly and prevented the sheet from blowing off the line in wind. The sheet would be positioned so the hem ends hung down evenly, looking neat and organized. Shirts and blouses were hung by the shoulders or by the tail, depending on the garment's design and the household's preference. Hanging by the shoulders meant the weight of the wet fabric pulled down, potentially stretching the shoulders, but it allowed the shirt to dry in a shape closer to how it would be worn. Hanging by the tail meant less stress on the shoulders, but a potentially less neat appearance while drying. Trousers were hung by the waistband, usually with the legs hanging down fully extended. Some laundresses would give the legs a sharp snap before hanging to help remove wrinkles and encourage straight drying. Socks and stockings were hung in pairs, either by the toes or by the tops, depending on household preference. Hanging by the tops was easier, but hanging by the toes supposedly helped them dry faster and helped them maintain their shape better. Petticoats and skirts were hung by the waistband, spread out along the line to allow air circulation through the many layers of fabric. Victorian petticoats could have multiple layers of ruffles and fabric, and all of these needed to dry thoroughly to prevent musty smells or, worse, mildew. Wooden clothespins were used to secure items to the line, but not too many per item, because each pin could potentially leave a mark, a small indent in the fabric where the pin pinched it. The laundress had to balance using enough pins to keep items secure while using as few as possible to minimize marking. The items had to be spaced along the line with gaps between them. Air needed to circulate around each item for proper drying. If things were hung too close together, they might touch, which would slow drying and could cause items to develop damp, musty spots where they pressed against each other. White items were always hung in the sun if possible. The sun's rays acted as a natural bleach, helping to make whites even whiter. This is why you'd see white sheets hanging in yards and gardens, bright white against the green grass, a common sight in Victorian neighbourhoods on Mondays and Tuesdays. Coloured items, however, were hung in shade if possible. The sun would fade coloured fabrics over the time, particularly bright colours. Red, blue and green were especially vulnerable. So coloured items were hung under trees, under eaves, or in areas where they'd get air circulation without direct sunlight. Delicate items like lace and silk were never hung on the clothesline. Instead, they were laid flat on clean white cloths or towels, spread out carefully to maintain their shape. These were placed in shaded areas, away from direct sunlight, which could yellow or weaken the fibers. The drying area had to be clean, away from dust or dirt that could settle on the damp fabric. But what if the weather wasn't fine? What if it was raining, threatening rain, or if it was winter when outdoor drying was impractical or impossible? Then everything had to be dried indoors, which presented its own set of challenges. Indoor drying required space, lots of it, and most Victorian homes, particularly those of working-class families, didn't have space to spare. But laundry had to dry regardless, so the space was found somehow. Wooden drying racks called clothes horses were essential equipment for indoor drying. These were collapsible wooden frames with multiple horizontal bars where clothes could be draped. A typical clothes horse might have 5 or 6 bars, each capable of holding several items. The clothes horses would be set up near the fireplace or stove, close enough to benefit from the heat, but not so close that items would scorch or risk catching fire. This was a real danger. Fabric hanging near a fire or hot stove could ignite if a breeze blew it into the flames or if it heated up too much. Items were draped carefully over the bars of the clothes horses, spread out as much as possible. But with limited space, items often overlapped or touched, which meant they took much longer to dry. The room would become humid and damp, water vapor from the drying clothes condensing on windows, on walls, making everything feel clammy. In working-class homes with little space, wet laundry might be hung on ropes, strung across the kitchen or the main living room. The family would have to navigate around damp sheets hanging at head height, ducking under them to move around the room. The damp laundry would drip onto the floor, requiring buckets or rags to be placed underneath to catch the water. Children would be scolded for running through the drying laundry, for touching the damp sheets with dirty hands. The family cat or dog would have to be watched carefully to keep them from rubbing against drying items, or worse, pulling them down to nest in. Everything in the house would feel vaguely moist for days when drying indoors. Book would feel damp. Bread would go soft and potentially moldy faster. Matches might not light properly. It was uncomfortable and inconvenient, but it was necessary. Some items, particularly those that needed to be ironed, were actually taken down from the line or the drying rack while still damp. Completely dry items were much more difficult to iron effectively. So shirts, tablecloths, napkins, handkerchiefs, any items that required ironing were removed while they still had moisture in them. These damp items would be carefully rolled up to keep the moisture distributed evenly throughout the fabric. Rolling them prevented any one area from drying out before ironing could begin. The rolled items would be stacked in a basket, covered with a damp cloth to prevent drying, and kept until it was time to iron. The timing of this was important. Items couldn't be left damp for too long or they'd develop mildew, a moldy smell and appearance that was nearly impossible to remove. But they couldn't be allowed to dry completely or they'd be too difficult to iron. The laundress had to judge the timing based on the weather, the temperature, and her schedule. On a good drying day, with sun and breeze, items might be dry in a few hours. On a damp, cold day, or when drying indoors, it might take 2 or 3 days for everything to dry completely. The laundress had to work around this reality, timing her washing so that items would be dry when she needed them. And throughout the drying process, items had to be monitored. The laundress would check them periodically, feeling them to assess their dryness, bringing in items that were dry, removing items for ironing at just the right moment. Even the drying phase required attention and decision-making. By early evening on Monday, if things had gone well, the washing and the initial drying would be done. The laundress could finally stop, finally sit down properly, finally rest her aching body. She might eat a real meal if she had the energy to prepare one. She might just fall into bed done-tired, exhausted beyond description. But Tuesday loomed ahead. Tuesday was ironing day, and if washing was brutal, ironing was its own special form of endurance test. Tuesday morning came, and with it, the task of ironing. If you worked hard and efficiently on Monday, and if the weather had cooperated for the drying, you might have dry laundry ready to iron by Tuesday. If the weather hadn't cooperated, or if you had an especially large amount of washing, ironing might start on Wednesday or even Thursday. The work expanded to fill the time available. And there was always more work. The tools of Victorian ironing were simple but remarkably heavy. Sad irons, also called flat irons, were solid chunks of cast iron with a handle attached, either as part of the casting or as a separate removable wooden handle. The name sad iron came from an old use of the word sad, meaning solid or heavy, and these irons were certainly that. Irons came in various sizes and weights to suit different tasks. A small iron for delicate work might weigh 3 or 4 pounds. A medium iron for general use might weigh 6 or 7 pounds. Large irons for heavy linens could weigh 9 or 10 pounds. Using these irons required real physical strength and endurance. Most households that did their own ironing had multiple irons, usually at least 3 and ideally 5 or 6. The reason was simple. Irons had to be hot to work effectively, but they cooled down quickly during use. By having multiple irons, you could keep several heating while you used one, then swap to a fresh hot iron when the one you were using cooled down. The irons were heated on the kitchen stove, or sometimes on a special heating iron stove designed just for this purpose. In wealthier households, with a separate laundry, there might be a dedicated ironing stove. In most homes, the kitchen stove had to serve double duty. The heating process took careful attention. The irons were placed on the stove surface, usually on the hottest part, and left to heat for 15 or 20 minutes. As one iron was heating, another would be in use, and others would be cooling after use, waiting to be heated again. The rotation was constant. Heat, use, cool, heat again. The temperature of the iron was absolutely critical. Too hot, and you'd scorch the fabric, leaving a brown, shiny mark that screamed ironing disaster and was impossible to remove. The garment would be ruined, and if it was a valuable item or belonged to your employer, there would be consequences. Too cool, and the iron wouldn't effectively remove wrinkles. You'd be pressing and pressing, working harder, taking more time and achieving poor results. The garment would still look rumpled and unprofessional. There were no temperature dials, no settings to simply select. The laundress had to test the iron's heat using whatever method she'd learned or developed. The most common method was the spit test. She'd lick her finger and touch it quickly to the iron, or she'd simply spit on the iron's surface and watch what happened. If the spit sizzled and evaporated instantly with a violent hiss, the iron was too hot. If the spit just sat there and eventually evaporated slowly, the iron wasn't hot enough. If the spit sizzled moderately and evaporated in a couple of seconds, the temperature was about right. Another method was to bring the iron close to your cheek, not touching, but close enough to feel the radiated heat. An experienced laundress could judge the temperature this way with surprising accuracy. But it required careful attention. Misjudge and bring the iron too close, and you'd burn your face. Some laundresses would test on a scrap of fabric, a piece of old sheet or cloth kept for this purpose. Press the iron on the scrap and see what happened. If the scrap scorched, the iron was too hot. If the wrinkles didn't come out, too cool. These testing methods meant that burnt fingers and minor facial burns were occupational hazards. Small burn marks on a laundress's hands and forearms were so common as to be expected, almost a mark of the trade. The ironing surface was critical to good results. In wealthier households, there might be a purpose-built ironing table, a sturdy table at the right height for comfortable work. In most homes, a regular table was used, padded with old blankets or thick cloths to provide a firm but slightly cushioned surface. The padding couldn't be too soft, or the iron would sink into it, and the ironing would be ineffective. But it needed to be thick enough to provide some give and protect the table surface from heat and moisture. Finding the right balance was part of the art. An old sheet or clean cloth was placed over the padding to provide a smooth, clean surface for the items being ironed. This cover cloth had to be washed regularly because it would pick up dirt and residue from the items being ironed. The ironing itself was methodical, systematic work that couldn't be rushed. Each item had its own proper sequence for ironing, an order that ensured everything got pressed correctly and efficiently. For a man's shirt, the standard sequence was collar first, then cuffs, then sleeves, then yoke and shoulders, then the body of the shirt. This sequence made sense because the collar and cuffs needed to be especially crisp and were most visible when the shirt was worn. The collar would be spread out on the ironing surface, face down if it was a fold-over collar, and ironed carefully from one end to the other. The iron would be pressed down with a firm pressure, held for a moment to allow the heat to penetrate and smooth the fabric. Then move to the next section. Each pass of the iron overlapped slightly with the previous pass to ensure complete coverage. The collar was then flipped over and ironed on the other side. Some collars needed to be ironed multiple times, going over the same area again and again to achieve the crisp, flat appearance that was desired. This was especially true for starched collars, which we'll discuss more in a moment. The cuffs received the same careful treatment. Each cuff was spread flat, ironed on both sides, with extra attention to the edges and corners to ensure they were sharp and neat. The sleeves were ironed from shoulder to cuff, laid flat on the board, smoothed with the hand first to remove major wrinkles, then pressed with the iron. The seams had to be aligned properly, or the sleeve would have creases in the wrong places. The body of the shirt was done in sections, the yoke and shoulders, then the back, then each front panel. The iron was heavy, remember, 6 or 7 pounds minimum, and pushing it across fabric again and again required real strength, particularly in the arms and shoulders. And this was just one shirt. A household might have multiple shirts to iron for each male member of the family. For a large household or a professional laundress taking in work, there might be dozens of shirts. The work was repetitive in the extreme, the same motions over and over until your arms felt like they might fall off. Large, flat items like sheets and tablecloths were particularly challenging to iron alone. Ideally, these required 2 people. One person would iron, while another would help keep the fabric taut and smooth, feeding it across the ironing board, preventing new wrinkles from forming in areas that had already been ironed. When working alone, which was often the case, the laundress had to manage these large items herself. This meant constantly repositioning the fabric, using her body to keep parts of the sheet taut while ironing other parts, trying not to let the already ironed sections drag on the floor and pick up dirt. A large tablecloth could take 15 or 20 minutes to iron properly. A sheet, similarly. And most households had multiple sheets and tablecloths. The time added up quickly. Hours and hours of standing, pressing, repositioning, pressing again. The iron itself needed constant attention. As it cooled during use, it would become less effective. The laundress would notice that the wrinkles weren't coming out as easily, that she had to press harder and make more passes. This was the signal to switch to a freshly heated iron. She'd return the cooling iron to the stove to reheat and pick up a hot one. But the hot iron might be too hot, so it might need a moment to cool slightly. Or it might need the spit test before use. This constant rotation of irons, monitoring their temperature, swapping them out, was another layer of attention required throughout the process. As each item was ironed to satisfaction, wrinkles removed, fabric smooth and crisp, it was immediately folded or hung to prevent new wrinkles from forming. Shirts were hung on wooden hangers. Sheets and tablecloths were folded along their natural fold lines, smoothed with the hands and placed in neat stacks. Folding large items properly was itself a skill. The item had to be folded symmetrically, edges aligned perfectly, so it would look neat when stored or when unfolded for use. Sloppy folding could cause new wrinkles or make the item look carelessly handled. Ironing day was long, very long. A full day of ironing might mean 8, 10, 12 hours on your feet, holding heavy irons, pressing fabric, swapping irons, repositioning items. The heat from the stove and the irons made the work oppressive in summer. In winter, at least the heat was somewhat welcome. Though after hours of work, even winter heat became stifling. The laundress's shoulders would burn from holding and maneuvering the heavy irons. Her lower back would ache from standing and bending over the ironing board. Her wrists would be sore from the constant pressure and movement. If she'd burned herself testing iron temperature, those burns would sting every time she worked. And we haven't even discussed starching yet, which added yet another layer of complexity to the ironing process. Starch was essential for certain items in a Victorian wardrobe. Gentlemen's collars and cuffs had to be crisp and stand up properly. Ladies' aprons, particularly white aprons worn by servants, needed to look fresh and maintain their shape. Table linens benefited from starch to give them body and a professional appearance. Doilies, antimacassars, and decorative linens absolutely required starch to maintain their form. But starching was labor-intensive and had to be done correctly, or the results would be poor. It was yet another skill that required practice and attention to detail. Starch was purchased as a powder, usually made from wheat or corn. It came in boxes or bags and had to be mixed with water to create a solution that could be used. This mixing had to be done correctly, or the starch would be lumpy, too thick, or too thin. The preparation typically began on the morning of ironing day, though some laundresses prepared starch the evening before. The starch powder was placed in a bowl, and a small amount of cold water was added, just enough to make a smooth paste. This paste had to be mixed thoroughly to eliminate all lumps, because lumps in the starch solution would create lumps on the fabric when ironed. The laundress would work the paste with her fingers or a spoon, crushing any lumps against the side of the bowl, adding water, drop by drop, mixing constantly. This could take several minutes of work to get the paste perfectly smooth. Once the paste was smooth, boiling water was added gradually while stirring constantly. The starch would cook in the hot water, thickening and becoming translucent. The consistency had to be just right. Too thick and it would be difficult to work with and would flake off the fabric when dry. Too thin and it wouldn't provide enough stiffness. Testing the consistency was done by feel and experience. The laundress might dip her fingers in the cooled starch and rub them together, feeling how it behaved. She might lift a spoonful and watch how it poured back into the bowl, judging the thickness by how it flowed. Some laundresses added a small amount of brax or salt to the starch solution, believing it made the starch more effective and gave better results. Others added a tiny drop of kerosene or paraffin, which supposedly made the ironed items shinier and more resistant to dirt. These additions were personal preferences, techniques passed down or discovered through experimentation. Once the starch solution was ready and cooled to a comfortable temperature, the items that needed starching were dipped into it. Each item would be submerged completely, then lifted out and squeezed to remove excess starch. The amount of starch left in the fabric would determine how stiff the item would be when dry. For collars that needed to be very stiff, almost board-like, the item might be dipped, squeezed lightly to leave plenty of starch, then dipped again for a double dose. For items that needed just a bit of body, like a blouse or apron, one dip with thorough squeezing would be enough. The starched items were then wrung out, but not as thoroughly as items that hadn't been starched. They needed to retain some moisture for the ironing process. They were rolled up to keep the moisture and starch distributed evenly and set aside until it was time to iron them. Ironing starched items was different from ironing regular items. The starch made the fabric stiffer and more resistant, requiring a very hot iron and firm pressure. The heat of the iron would essentially bake the starch onto and into the fabric fibers, creating that crisp, stiff texture. For heavily starched collars, the ironing process was particularly demanding. The collar would be spread on the ironing board and pressed with a very hot iron, held down with significant pressure, allowing the heat to penetrate completely. The collar would be flipped and ironed on the other side. Then it might be ironed again on the first side, and again on the second side, multiple passes until the collar was completely dry and stiff as a board. This took patience and strength. Your arms would burn from holding the heavy iron down with firm pressure. The heat coming off the iron would make your face flush. The process couldn't be rushed. Rush it, and the collar would be insufficiently stiff, wilting within hours of being worn. Sometimes a special iron was used for collars, a smaller, heavier iron that could be pressed very firmly into the fabric. Some irons had a curved surface specifically designed for ironing curved collar edges. Starched aprons and blouses required similar technique, though usually not quite as extreme as collars. Multiple passes with a hot iron, working the starch into the fabric, creating a crisp, fresh appearance that would last through a day of wear. The ironed starched items had a characteristic appearance, smooth, crisp, with a slight sheen. They felt different too, stiffer, almost papery. A properly starched collar would make a faint crackling sound when worn, the starch breaking slightly with movement. But starch had its downsides. Heavily starched items were uncomfortable to wear, particularly in warm weather. A starched collar could chafe the neck. Starched cuffs could irritate wrists. But fashion and propriety demanded these discomforts, so people endured them. Over time, starch would yellow, requiring items to be washed again to remove the old starch before applying new. Starch also attracted dirt and stains more readily than unstretched fabric, meaning items needed more frequent washing. For the laundress, working with starch meant additional mess, and The starch solution would splash and drip, leaving spots on the ironing surface, on the floor, on her clothing. Her hands would feel sticky and stiff from repeated contact with the starch. The process added at least an hour, often several hours, to the already lengthy ironing day. By the end of Tuesday, or Wednesday if the ironing had taken longer, every item would finally be clean, dry, ironed, and ready to be put away. The laundress could look at the stacks of folded linens, the hung shirts, the carefully pressed dresses and aprons, and feel a sense of accomplishment. The work was done, at least until next week when it would all begin again. But her body would be screaming in protest. Days of standing, lifting, carrying, stirring, wringing, scrubbing, and ironing would have taken their toll. She'd need Wednesday or Thursday to recover somewhat before Friday's tasks, whatever those might be, would begin. If we want to truly understand the life of a Victorian laundress, we need to look at what the work did to her body over time. This wasn't just tiring work. It was work that literally shaped the physical form of the women who did it, leaving permanent marks and causing lasting damage. The hands told the story most clearly. A laundress's hands were unlike anyone else's hands, immediately identifiable to anyone who knew what to look for. They were red, not just a temporary flush, but a permanent redness from constant water exposure and harsh chemicals. The skin was thick and calloused, particularly on the palms where she gripped washboards and dolly sticks, and on the fingertips where she worked fabric and tested water temperature. The knuckles were often rough, sometimes scarred from scraping against washboards during countless hours of scrubbing. The fingernails, if she had any to speak of, were short, often broken or worn down from the constant wet work. Long nails were impractical and would break off within hours of laundry work. The skin of a laundress's hands was perpetually dry and cracked, despite any treatments she might try. The harsh soap used in Victorian laundries was brutal on skin. Made with lye and animal fat, it was designed to clean clothes, not to be gentle on human hands. It stripped away the natural oils that keep skin soft and supple, leaving it dry, tight, and prone to cracking. These cracks were not superficial. They were deep fissures that would open up across knuckles, around nail beds, and on the pads of fingers. Deep enough to bleed. Deep enough to be painful with every touch, every movement. And they would get wet repeatedly throughout the wash day, the water stinging in the cracks, the soap burning in the open wounds. At night, after a day of washing, a laundress might try to treat her hands with whatever she could afford. Goose grease was common. The rendered fat from a goose that could be rubbed into the hands to provide some moisture and protection. Mutton tallow worked similarly. These greases were thick, sticky, and smelly, but they were what was available and affordable. Some women would spread the grease on their hands thickly before bed, then wrap their hands in old cloth to prevent the grease from getting on the bedding. They'd sleep with their hands wrapped like crude bandages, hoping the overnight treatment would heal some of the damage. But the next morning, when work began again, the water and soap would wash away the grease, and the cycle would continue. It was impossible to truly heal hands that were damaged every single day. In winter, the problem intensified dramatically. The constant transition from hot water to cold water, from the warm, steamy washhouse to the frigid outdoor air when hanging laundry, was torture on the hands. The skin would chap even more severely. Chilblains would develop, a painful condition where the skin becomes inflamed and swollen from repeated exposure to cold followed by rapid rewarming. Chilblains were agonizing. The affected areas, usually fingers and hands, would become red, swollen, and itchy. The itching was intense and constant, but scratching only made it worse. Eventually, chilblains could cause the skin to blister and crack open, creating yet more wounds that would be exposed to water and soap day after day. Beyond the hands, the back was perhaps the most damaged part of a laundress's body. The constant bending over washtubs, the lifting of heavy wet items, the stirring of the copper with its long wooden stick. All of this put enormous strain on the spine and lower back. Victorian laundresses worked in an era before there was any understanding of ergonomics or body mechanics. They didn't know about keeping their back straight when lifting, about bending at the knees instead of the waist, about taking breaks to stretch and relieve pressure. They simply worked in whatever way got the job done, and their backs paid the price. Many laundresses developed chronic back pain that never truly went away. It might be a dull, constant ache that was always present in the background. It might be sharp pain that struck when moving certain ways. It might be stiffness that made getting out of bed in the morning a slow, painful process. As they aged, many laundresses became visibly stooped, their posture permanently altered by years of bending over tubs and washboards. The spine would develop a curve, the shoulders rounding forward, the head jutting forward from the body. This wasn't just poor posture that could be corrected with awareness. This was structural change to the spine itself, bones and discs permanently affected by decades of strain. The shoulders suffered terribly as well. Stirring a copper full of wet, heavy laundry required sustained effort from the shoulder muscles and the rotator cuff. Wringing out wet sheets required powerful rotation of the shoulders. Lifting heavy wet items repeatedly stressed the shoulder joints. Over time, laundresses would develop what we'd now recognize as rotator cuff injuries, shoulder bursitis, and similar chronic conditions. The pain would be sharp and stabbing with certain movements, dull and aching at rest. Eventually, the shoulder might lose some range of motion, unable to reach as high or rotate as far as it once could. The arms and wrists bore heavy burdens too. The constant wringing motion put enormous strain on the forearms and wrists. Tendinitis was common, inflammation of the tendons that connect muscles to bones. This caused pain, weakness, and sometimes a sensation of crackling or popping when moving the wrist or elbow. The feet and legs suffered from the long hours of standing on hard floors. Varicose veins developed frequently in laundresses, the veins in the legs becoming enlarged and twisted from constant standing, and the pressure of blood pooling in the lower extremities. The feet themselves would ache constantly, the arches would hurt. The heels would develop thick calluses. The toes might be compressed and damaged from boots that were worn long past when they should have been replaced. Because new boots were an expense that was hard to afford. The constant dampness was another issue. Working around water all day meant your feet were often damp, either from water splashing into your boots or from the general humidity. Damp feet in old boots were a recipe for fungal infections, painful conditions that were difficult to treat in an era before modern antifungal medications. The respiratory system took damage too. Breathing in steam, soap fumes, and the smoke from the fire under the copper all day, every week, for years on end, affected the lungs. Many laundresses developed chronic coughs that never went away. Bronchitis was common, inflammation of the breathing tubes that made breathing difficult and coughing frequent. In the worst cases, the combination of heat, steam, damp working conditions, and hard physical labor could contribute to heart problems. The constant physical exertion in hot, humid conditions put strain on the heart and circulatory system. The overall picture of a long-time laundress was often that of someone who looked older than her years. A woman of 35 might look 50 and her face would be lined from squinting in the steam, from the constant expression of concentration and effort. Her body would be worn, shoulders rounded, back curved, hands permanently damaged. And yet, these women persisted. They did this work because they had to. There were families to feed, rent to pay, children to raise. The work didn't stop because your hands hurt or your back ached. You worked through the pain because the alternative was worse. The alternative was poverty, starvation, homelessness. So you worked, and your body paid the price. And that was simply how life was. In the complex hierarchy of Victorian society, laundresses occupied an interesting and somewhat contradictory position. The work was essential. Everyone needed clean clothes after all. And skilled laundresses who could handle delicate fabrics without damage were valued. But the work was also seen as low status, physically demanding in a way that marked you as a laborer rather than someone with refined skills. For a servant working in a large household, the position of laundry maid was often considered less desirable than other positions like lady's maid, parlour maid, or even housemaid. The laundry maid worked in the basement or in a separate wash house, isolated from the main household activities. She didn't interact with the family or their guests. She didn't receive the cast-off clothing that other servants might receive. Her work kept her in the background, quite literally underground sometimes. The physical nature of laundry work also marked it as less refined. A laundry maid emerged from her workday red-faced, damp with sweat and steam, hands rough and red, clothing often splashed with water and soap. She smelled of soap and steam, not unpleasant necessarily, but certainly distinctive. There was nothing genteel about it. Yet skill did command some respect. A truly excellent laundress who could handle fine lace without damage, who could remove impossible stains, who could starch a collar to absolute perfection, such a woman had real value. In a large household with a staff of servants, the head laundress might oversee several laundry maids and have some authority within the household hierarchy. Professional laundresses who worked independently, taking in washing from multiple families, had a different social position. They were self-employed, running their own small businesses even if those businesses barely kept them afloat. There was a degree of independence in this that servants didn't have, and independence had its own value. A professional laundress could choose which clients to work for, at least in theory. She could refuse to take laundry from families who didn't pay promptly or who complained unreasonably. She could set her own schedule, more or less, though the reality was that the work dictated the schedule more than any freedom of choice did. But professional laundresses also faced challenges that household servants didn't. They had to find and maintain a steady stream of clients. They had to deal with the business aspects of the work, collecting payment, managing supplies, maintaining equipment. And if they couldn't work because of illness or injury, there was no income, no safety net at all. The rates charged for laundry work were kept low by fierce competition. In any neighborhood, There were multiple women willing to take in washing, and families would go with whoever charged less if the quality was acceptable. This meant laundresses were constantly pressured to work faster, to take on more clients, to push themselves harder just to make enough to survive. A professional laundress might charge a few pence per item, with variations based on size and type. A sheet might cost more than a handkerchief naturally. A heavily soiled item might cost extra. But even with multiple families as clients, the income was barely sufficient. It was survival work, not a path to prosperity. Some laundresses supplemented their income with other work. They might take in sewing or mending, stitching and repairing garments in whatever time they could find between laundry tasks. They might do charring, which was cleaning work, scrubbing floors and windows in wealthier homes. Anything to bring in a few more pennies. The work was isolating, particularly for professional laundresses working from home. Unlike servants who lived in households with other servants, sharing meals and living spaces and forming friendships, a laundress working alone spent most of her time in solitary labor. Her companions were her washtubs and copper, her arms deep in soapy water, her mind occupied with the work at hand. If she had children, they'd be her company. But managing children while doing laundry was its own challenge. Small children had to be kept away from the copper and the hot water. They'd be underfoot, needing attention, while she was trying to work. Older children might help with simpler tasks, but they were also supposed to be in school, not laboring at home. The communal wash houses provided a different social environment, one of the few spaces where working-class women could congregate regularly. Women would arrive at the wash house on Monday morning, pay their small fee, and claim their coppers and tubs. Then they'd work side by side for hours, steam rising around them, and they'd talk. This was where news was shared, where gossip spread, where information about jobs and opportunities circulated. If someone knew of a family looking for a charwoman, word would spread at the wash house. If someone's husband had found work or lost work, the wash house would hear about it. Friendships formed over steaming coppers and shared labor. Women would help each other, perhaps helping wring out a particularly heavy item, offering advice on a stubborn stain, sharing a bit of tea during a brief break. There was solidarity in shared hardship, a sense of understanding that came from all doing the same brutal work. But it wasn't always friendly. Disputes would break out over space, over access to the best coppers, over whose turn it was at the water pump. Arguments could escalate quickly when everyone was tired, hot, and stressed. A woman who felt someone's dirty wash water had splashed into her clean rinse water might react angrily. And then voices would be raised and others would take sides. The wash house supervisor, Balin, usually a stern woman who'd been doing laundry for decades and had seen every kind of drama possible, would have to maintain order. She'd settle disputes, enforce the rules, keep things moving. It was like managing a factory, except the workers were independent, exhausted, and often at the end of their patience. Despite the hardships, despite the exhaustion and the pain and the meager income, there was a certain pride in being good at the work. A laundress who could look at a pile of dirty, stained laundry and know she could get it clean. Who could transform a heap of soiled clothing into neat, fresh, properly pressed garments, took satisfaction in that skill. It was visible, tangible work. At the end of laundry day, you could see the results of your labor. The clean white sheets hanging on the line. The stack of perfectly pressed shirts. the transformation from dirty to clean. In a life where so much was uncertain and so much was beyond your control, this was something concrete, something you could point to and say, I did that. But the larger society didn't give laundresses much recognition for their essential work. They were largely invisible, noticed only when something went wrong, when a stain wasn't removed or an item was damaged. When the work was done well, it was simply expected, taken for granted. The women who did this work, who spent their lives in steam and harsh soap, who sacrificed their hands and backs and health to keep society's clothing clean, they deserved far more recognition and respect than they ever received. They were essential workers, though that term didn't exist then, performing labor that kept households and society functioning. So there we have it. A journey through the world of Victorian laundry. From the Sunday evening preparation, through the long days of washing, drying, and ironing, through the physical toll and the social world of the women who did this work. It's remarkable, isn't it, to think about how much effort went into something we now accomplish with almost no thought. We throw clothes into a machine, add detergent, press a button, and walk away. An hour later, the washing is done. We move the clothes to a dryer, press another button, and an hour after that, everything is clean and dry. Many modern fabrics don't even need ironing. Or if they do, we have lightweight electric irons with temperature controls and steam functions. The average Victorian laundress would be absolutely astounded by this. The idea that you could wash an entire week's worth of laundry in 2 or 3 hours, with minimal physical effort and clean, soft hands afterward, would seem like pure fantasy. Magic. Impossible. And yet, here we are. We've come so far in such a relatively short time. It's barely more than a century since the time we've been discussing, and the transformation in domestic labor has been revolutionary. But maybe there's real value in understanding how it used to be done, in knowing what our ancestors, our great-great-grandmothers, went through for something as basic as clean clothes. It gives us perspective, doesn't it? It makes us appreciate what we have. Not in a you should be grateful way, but in a genuine understanding of how much human labor went into daily necessities before modern technology. The next time you load your washing machine, take a moment to think about the Victorian laundress. Think about her rising before dawn in the cold and dark. Think about her carrying bucket after bucket of water. Think about her standing over a steaming copper for hours, stirring with a heavy wooden stick. Think about her red, cracked hands, her aching back, her exhaustion at the end of the day. Think about how that was her life, every single week, year after year, for wages that barely kept her alive. Think about the countless women whose names we'll never know, who spent their entire lives doing this work, who were essential to keeping society functioning, but were never recognized or celebrated for it. History isn't just about kings and queens and great events and famous people. It's also about ordinary people doing ordinary things. And sometimes, the ordinary things are the most revealing, the most human, the most worthy of our attention and respect. Laundry tells us about how people lived, what they valued, how society was structured, what daily life actually looked like beyond the fancy dinners and grand balls. It tells us about class and gender and labor and technology and change. And it tells us about resilience, about human beings finding ways to survive and even find moments of pride and satisfaction in brutally hard work. So as we come to the end of this long journey tonight, I hope you found it interesting or relaxing or at least informative. If you're still awake, thank you for staying with me through this detailed exploration of Victorian laundry. And if you're drifting off to sleep or already asleep, I hope you're having peaceful dreams, free from wash tubs and steaming coppers. Sleep well, everyone. Rest your modern hands that have never known the harsh bite of lye soap. Be glad for your washing machine, your dryer, your easy care fabrics. And spare a thought for the women who came before, who did the work so we wouldn't have to. Good night. If you enjoyed this journey into the past, please consider subscribing for more long-form history content designed for relaxation and sleep. Leave a comment letting me know what historical topic you'd like to explore next. What period or place or aspect of daily life interests you? Or just tell me how you're doing. I read all the comments and appreciate everyone. Until next time, sleep well. And remember, history is all around us, even in the most ordinary moments. The simple acts of daily life, like washing clothes, connect us to the past and to all the people who came before us. Sweet dreams.